education, he would not have found it possible to have conceived such a crime.
Образование и какую-то юридическую. Но непосредственные исполнители.
Well, of course, the people who did this were cruel and remorseless people, but they were not the main perpetrators. The main perpetrators were in the Central Committee of the party. They were the ones who committed the crime to top all crimes, as the Poles would call it. They were the ones who tried to cover it all up.
In 1943, here at the Foreign Office in London, a British diplomat wrote a report that suggested that the Soviet Union had indeed been responsible for the mass killings at Katyn, something that resulted in a series of anxious memos in response from some of the most senior officials at the Foreign Office.
Well, gentlemen, it is obviously an awkward matter when fighting for a moral cause that our allies are open to accusations of this kind. It is our intention to deal with war criminals.
Yes. I confess that in a cowardly fashion I had rather turn my head away from the scene at Katyn for fear of what I should find there. I think no one has pointed out that on a purely moral plane this is not new. How many thousands of its citizens has the Soviet Union butchered? And quite clearly for the moment there's nothing to be done.
Neither the British nor the American governments wanted to know too much about the war crime committed here in the forest of Katyn near Smolensk. And if their ally, Joseph Stalin, had ordered the murders, they preferred the world not to know. Churchill wrote in a confidential note in April 1943 that there is no use prowling morbidly round the 3-year-old graves of Smolensk. But Stalin's desire to see leading citizens of Eastern Poland destroyed cast a long shadow. Boguslava Griniev never found the remains of her father. All she has is his name inscribed on her mother's grave. It was placed there after the fall of communism, when she finally learnt that he had been killed at one of the murder sites back in the spring of 1940.
I have missed him throughout my life. I've really missed my father throughout my life. I would like to say that from where I now stand at the age of 82, I do not consider the war and being deported to have been the tragedy of my life. I consider the tragedy of my life to have been my father's murder. The murder of a very just and noble man who was not charged with anything and for whom there was no justice.
Stalin blamed the Germans for the murders, and because the Poles didn't go along with his version of history, he broke off diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile. The headline in Pravda on the 19th of April 1943 read, "Hitler's Polish Collaborators," and the article accused the Polish government in exile of striking a treacherous blow at the Soviet Union. Meantime, Churchill had kept his promise to Stalin. The British and Americans had opened a kind of second front in North Africa.
The Yanks are ready. The doughboys are spread out for miles behind every tree and shrub, ready to strike the enemy or repel infiltration.
But the Western Allies were facing tougher opposition here than expected. This put into jeopardy any plans to invade France in 1943. The real Second Front Stalin so craved. And so Churchill travelled to Washington for a meeting with President Roosevelt in May 1943.
The Russian effort is prodigious and places us in their debt, a position from which we would like to emerge. But as I have already mentioned, the best way of taking the weight off the Russian front in 1943 is to get or knock Italy out of the war. This would force the Germans to send a large number of troops to hold down the Balkans.
With regard to taking weight off of Russia, the United Nations should continue with a strategy which compels the Germans to fight. For that reason, I question...
There was clear conflict between Britain and America over what to do next. Churchill now wanted to invade Italy, but the Americans had other ideas.
The most effective way of forcing the Germans to fight is by carrying out cross-channel operation.
The reality was that Roosevelt's relationship with Churchill was a good deal less cosy than the propaganda of the time portrayed.
Or some parts of it.
I think Churchill thought at times he was handling Roosevelt. Roosevelt was pretty confident all the time he was handling Churchill. You couldn't read Roosevelt the way you could read Churchill.
Almost at the same time as Roosevelt was trying to handle Churchill, he was doing his best to handle Stalin as well.
Thank you.
Just days before meeting Churchill, Roosevelt had written a letter to be hand-delivered to the Soviet leader.
Shall we begin?
And he had been careful to keep the contents a secret from the British.
My dear Mr. Stalin, I am sending you this personal note by the hands of my old friend Joseph E. Davis. It relates only to one subject.
Roosevelt had chosen his messenger carefully. Joseph Davis, a rich lawyer, had been American ambassador to Moscow in the 1930s. Now, accompanied by the current American ambassador, he entered Stalin's office at the same time as Churchill was visiting the American president in Washington. Davis was hugely sympathetic to Stalin and the Soviet Union.
I'm glad to present Mr. Davis to you, Mr. Stalin.
He hadn't just written a positive book about his time in Moscow. He'd also seen it recently turned into a feature film.
Mission to Moscow is my report to the American people as Ambassador of the United States to the Soviet Union. I wrote it as I saw it and lived it.
Mission to Moscow, the behind-the-scenes story of every world-shaking crisis of our day. With Walter Houston as Ambassador Davies, Anne Harding as Mrs. Davies, with a superb cast portraying Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, and other world figures, reenacting for the screen the cataclysmic events which changed the entire course of human history.
Thank you. Molotov. Mr. Molotov. Thank you. It is vital to the war and to a post-war peace that our governments, despite ideological differences, can work together. Britain, after this war, will be financially through for a long time. So post-war peace depends on the unity of our two countries in this situation. It's most unfortunate that you and President Roosevelt haven't been able to meet. The President attaches great importance to just such a meeting, and that's why he's sent me as a special envoy to present this to you personally.
The letter invited Stalin to a private meeting with Roosevelt. And it was clear from the list of possible locations Roosevelt suggested for the encounter that the American president specifically wanted to exclude Churchill.
Идея встретиться в Исландии мне не нравится, так как для нас обоих это означает довольно тяжелый перелет. К тому же, откровенно говоря, нам будет трудно сделать это, не пригласив туда же премьер-министра Черчилля. В связи с этим я предлагаю встретиться...
Roosevelt wrote that his preferred meeting place for just the two of them would be either Siberia or Alaska.
Дело, удачи, всегда искренне ваш Франклин Делано Рузвельт.
Roosevelt was desperately anxious to meet Stalin face-to-face without Churchill present. Then, he thought, it would be easier for him to work his magic and handle the Soviet leader.
Думаю, ваш президент прав. Он великий человек. Передайте вашему президенту, что я буду очень рад встретиться с ним.
The feature film Mission to Moscow was a mockery of the truth. It showed nothing of the fear and suspicion that really existed in Soviet society. A wrong word, a meeting with the wrong person, could end in disaster.
When one tried to meet Russians, you could see they were very afraid of meeting foreigners. There was this sort of shadow over them, and one felt it the whole time. One felt desperately sorry for them.
As a member of the military mission to Moscow, Hugh Lungi always suspected that the Soviets were spying on the British. And just after the war was over, he discovered the truth.
And I thought one day that I would explore a particular part of the rooms, and every room was bugged, including our cipher room, and it was either bugged under these ventilators or in the skirting boards. We made silly noises down the microphones and said various sort of rude things, and then pulled them out. There were newspapers packing these microphones dating back to 37, 38. So obviously they'd been there all the time.
The Soviet authorities were suspicious of all foreigners, which created a huge problem for them in a place like this, Archangel, in the far north of the Soviet Union. Here it was almost impossible to stop the locals fraternizing with visiting Allied sailors, strangers who brought with them a touch of glamour. When the sailors relaxed ashore, they frequented a special club for foreigners that was built here, the International Club. Locals could only come inside by invitation, and many of those who were invited were, not surprisingly, attractive young women.